Late in the fall of 1887, on a stretch of wind-scoured ground north of North Platte, Nebraska, Quillen Voss was doing something no one in that country had ever seen before. He was not raising a cabin. He was not laying up sod. He was not digging into the earth for shelter. He was turning a sealed iron cylinder into a home. It lay on its side across the open ground, dark and heavy, like part of a machine that had broken loose from the industrial world and rolled out onto the frontier by mistake. The curved shell was too smooth, too hard, too unnatural for that place. On those plains, survival spoke in wood, stone, mud, and labor that could be cut, stacked, or hauled. But Quillen Voss had staked his family's life on riveted iron. The sound carried for miles. Clang, clang, clang. Each hammer blow rang through the cold air with the sharp, metallic certainty of something that did not belong there. Men who knew cabins, windbreaks, stove heat, and winter loss would have looked at that iron hull and seen only one thing: a metal coffin waiting for snow. And yet the question stood there, with the cylinder itself. If every wooden cabin in that country bled heat through cracks, seams, and shifting boards, then what if the strange thing on Quillen Voss's land was not madness at all? What if it was the first honest answer to a problem everyone else had mistaken for fate? That is the kind of frontier story worth holding on to. And to help us continue bringing you stories just like this one, please support us by subscribing to the channel and liking this video. Your support helps these hard-won histories get told. So stay right here, because that winter would not argue, it would judge. And men like Harlan Pike did not need long to pass judgment. Pike was a cattle rancher who had spent enough winters on that ground to mistake endurance for final truth. He reined in his horse and studied the iron cylinder from a short distance, saying nothing at first. Beside him sat Eben Sorrell, a wiry teamster with a quick mouth and a quicker laugh, the kind of man who liked to reach a conclusion before the dust had settled. Harlan looked at the curved iron sections. He looked at the flat stone base. He listened to the ringing blows of Quillen's hammer. Then he made up his mind. That fool's building a kettle to freeze his whole family in. Eben laughed at once, but what mattered was not the laugh. It was the authority behind it. Harlan Pike had lived through blizzards, livestock loss, frozen pumps, split boards, chimney failures, and mornings when a man's beard stiffened before sunrise. When he spoke about winter, people listened. So the verdict spread. Abner Holt, a store runner who carried talk faster than freight, repeated it in town before the week was out. By then the thing already had a name: Voss's Kettle. The name stuck because it fit the fear. In the common frontier logic of the place, iron pulled in cold. Iron sweated. Iron turned damp air into running water. Water turned bedding wet. Wet bedding brought sickness. And sickness in winter did not stay small for long. In their minds, Quillen Voss was not building a strange house. He was sealing his wife and children inside a steel shell that would turn clammy by nightfall and deadly by Christmas. And the hard truth was this: their objection was not foolish. It came from real winters, real walls, real failure. That was what gave their contempt its weight, and that was what made it worthy of judgment. That was the easy version of the story. A strange man builds a strange house. The neighbors laugh. Winter comes, truth follows. But that was not the real shape of it. The real question was harder and far more useful. How did one man look at a sealed iron cylinder and see shelter where everyone else saw danger? How did Quillen Voss, standing in the same wind, hearing the same warnings, knowing the same cost of a bad winter, come to trust a material that every seasoned settler around him believed would turn against him? That question matters, because this was never just a quarrel between one stubborn man and his neighbors. It was a quarrel between two ways of understanding survival. One way said warmth came from habit, from wood, from thicker quilts, from more fuel, from enduring what could not be changed. The other way asked a different thing. What if the problem was not the cold itself? What if the real problem was the way a house lost heat after it had been made? That is where this story begins to turn. Because hidden inside it are four plain ideas that most men saw every day but never joined together: container, seal, shape, and heat. Not fancy words, not modern theory, just practical truths sitting in the open. Watch closely now. This is not only the story of a man being mocked and later proved right. It is the story of the difference between suffering through winter and understanding the exact way winter steals warmth from a home. And to understand why Quillen saw that difference, it is necessary to know what kind of work had shaped his hands long before he ever set foot on Nebraska ground. Quillen Voss had not come from a place that taught men how to stack logs against the wind. He came from iron. Before Nebraska, before open ground and long winters, he had worked in the steam shops along the Great Lakes, places where heat was not something a man fought, but something he had to contain. There, the work was not about building walls to keep weather out. It was about building shells strong enough and tight enough to hold pressure that could not be seen and could not be forgiven if it escaped. His tools were not axes and drawing knives. They were calipers, gauges, hammers for rivets, and the practiced eye that could read a seam the way other men read grain in wood. He understood things that did not announce themselves. That heat moved whether a man noticed it or not, that a flat surface gave way where a curved one held, that a joint was never as strong as the care taken to close it, and that the true measure of any structure was not how it looked from the outside, but how completely it held what mattered on the inside. When he brought Mara, his wife, and their two children, Ephraim and Ruth, out to that stretch of Nebraska land, he carried those lessons with him. He carried tools that had once sealed iron against force strong enough to tear metal apart. But on the frontier, none of that counted. Out there, a man was measured by what he could cut, lift, and stack. Wood was trusted, iron was not. Skill meant knowing how to build fast, patch often, and endure what could not be fixed. By that measure, Quillen Voss had arrived in the wrong place. At least, that was how it looked. But sometimes a man only appears misplaced because the real problem around him has not yet been named. So in that first season, Quillen Voss did not argue with anyone. He did what the land expected of him. He cut what timber he could find, cottonwood and rough pine, green and heavy, and raised a cabin the same way every man around him had done. The walls went up fast. The joints were packed with mud, grass, and fiber. The roof held. The door closed. From a distance, it looked right. It looked like a home. But what stood there was not a container. It was a shelter that only worked when the weather allowed it to. When winter came down hard, the truth showed itself. The wood began to dry and pull apart. Seams that had seemed tight in autumn opened by degrees too small to see, but large enough for wind to find. The door frame shifted. A thin gap formed along one side, and through it came a steady, whispering draft that never stopped. It did not rush. It did not howl. It simply stayed. Mara hung thick blankets across the doorway to slow it. She kept a pot of water on the stove, not for comfort, but to keep the air from turning so dry it scraped the throat raw. Still, the cold worked its way in. At night, the pattern became exact. Toward 3 a.m, the fire would fall to embers, and the heat would fall with it fast, faster than it could be rebuilt. The floor turned hard and biting. The far corners of the room might as well have been outside. Frost filmed the north wall in a dull, pale layer. Ruth began to cough. Small at first, then deeper. Ephraim slept in his coat without being told. Mara said very little, but the way she held the girl close through the night made it clear enough. This structure was not doing the one thing it had to do. For Quillen, that truth cut deeper than discomfort. He had spent years building vessels that held force no man could see. And now, in a house he had raised with his own hands, he could not hold a measure of warmth for his children. The failure was not in effort. It was not in fuel. It was in the thing itself. They were feeding heat into a structure that had never been made to keep it. That was the point where most men would have accepted the cost and settled in to endure it. Quillen Voss did not. He began to look harder not only at his own cabin, but at every other one within riding distance. The same pattern showed itself again and again. Big fires, constant feeding of wood, men sitting close to the stove, backs turned to the rest of the room, walls that felt warm for a short span, then faded back into cold. Heat rising, thinning, disappearing, and always the same quiet enemy at work. Air slipping in low, warmth slipping out high, never stopping, never sealing. What most men called hardship, Quillen began to see as failure, not of effort, not of will, but of design. The truth, once he saw it, was difficult to unsee. These cabins were not holding heat at all. They were trying to warm a moving stream air that never stayed long enough to be kept. Every crack, every seam, every shrinking board turned the inside of a home into part of the outside world. The fire did its work, and the structure undid it just as fast. It was like trying to fill a bucket with no bottom. Or worse, like trying to heat a river. That was the turn. The cold was not the real enemy. The cold only exposed the weakness. The real problem was the container. A house on that open ground was not just a place to block wind. It had to hold what a man fought to create. It had to keep heat the way a vessel kept pressure completely, or not at all. A wooden cabin, built fast and loose against the wind, was a leaking box. It could not keep what mattered. And once Quillen named that truth, the rest of the choices in front of him began to fall into order. Because if a house had to be a container, then it had to be built like one. And once the problem had a name, the solution did not arrive as an invention. It arrived as recognition. In the spring of 1887, word moved along the freight line that a farm machinery yard outside the rail spur was clearing out old equipment pressure drums from worn threshing engines, sections of curved iron shell no longer worth repairing. To most men, it was dead weight, awkward, hard to move, good for scrap and little else. Quillen Voss saw something different. He saw a shape that already knew how to hold, a curved shell, thick enough to carry heat, strong enough to stay true, and, if joined correctly, capable of sealing what it enclosed. He bought what he could: 2 main sections of iron hull, and a shorter end piece at a price that reflected their worth to everyone but him. Then he set about the harder part, getting them home. There was no easy way to move such weight across open ground. He borrowed a wagon not built for it, cut rollers from straight timber, and worked the pieces forward a few feet at a time. Lever, roll, reset. Lever, roll, reset. It took days to cross distances a man could walk in minutes. And every time he hauled another section across the prairie, someone saw. And every time someone saw, they laughed. The sound followed him, just as steady as the wind. But by then, it no longer mattered, because the idea was no longer only in his mind. It had weight now, surface, curvature. He could lay a hand against it and know, not hope, that if it were joined the right way, it would do something no wooden wall ever had. It would hold what could not be seen. And once the iron was on his land, the work changed its nature. This was no longer an idea moving through a man's mind. It was weight that had to be set true or not at all. Quillen began with the ground. He laid a low foundation of flat stone, leveled by hand, not for show, but to ensure the cylinder would rest without twist or strain. A vessel that held heat could not afford to sit wrong. Even a small shift would open the kind of weakness he had spent his life learning to avoid. From there, the lifting began. Lever, roll, set. With cut timber as rollers and rope under tension, the first iron section moved into place, then the second, then the shorter end piece, inch by inch, until the curve took its full shape on the ground. That was when the real work started. Quillen built a small forge beside the structure. Rivets were heated until they glowed dull orange. Mara, his wife, who had never been trained for such work but learned fast because there was no one else, caught each hot rivet in a bucket of sand and passed it where it needed to go. Quillen worked from inside the shell, bracing a heavy iron bar against the rivet head. Outside, Ephraim, his son, young but steady, brought the hammer down in clean, repeated strikes. Clang, clang, clang. Each blow shaped the metal. Each cooling rivet tightened its grip, pulling the curved plates together with a force no wood joint could match. The seam did not just meet, it locked. When the rivets were set, Quillen went further. He packed soft lead into the interior seams. He brushed a thick mixture of pitch and oil along the outer joints. He built a heavy, layered wooden door to fit tight within an iron collar. 2 small double-paned windows were set into place. Inside, he laid plank flooring over a bed of packed gravel and sand. At one end, he placed a compact, cast-iron stove, but he did not fix it in place just yet, not until he understood how the heat would move. Mara watched all of it closely. She worked beside him, but she also asked what no one else would. What happens when the metal sweats? What if the smoke doesn't pull right? What if the heat sits in one place and leaves the rest cold? And what happens at night, when the children are inside this thing? Quillen did not dismiss the questions. He did not answer them with long explanations. He answered them the only way that would matter: by continuing the work, by tightening every seam, by building as if each joint would be tested not by opinion but by winter. Out there, that was the only test that counted. By the time the structure stood complete in shape, there was little left to mock from a distance. So Harlan Pike came closer. He rode up slow, studying the cylinder not as a joke now, but as a problem he meant to understand. The laughter had thinned. What remained was something sharper curiosity edged with certainty that the flaw was there, waiting to be found. He circled once, looked at the seams, the door, the stovepipe collar. Then he spoke. "When that stove gets going," he said, "all that warm air is going to hit this cold iron." He tapped the outer shell with the back of his glove. "And it's going to sweat. Not a little. Enough to run. Down every wall." He paused, letting the picture form. "You'll have water in your bedding, in your floor, damp all through, kids breathing that all night. That ain't comfort. That's sickness." This was not ridicule. This was a man describing a failure he believed he had already seen, just waiting to happen again in a different shape. Mara heard every word, and this time there was no easy dismissal in her face, only a quiet, tightening concern. Because what Harlan described was not foolish, it was familiar. Quillen stopped his work. He wiped his hands on a rag, looked up once, not long, not in challenge, just enough to meet the man's eyes. He did not explain condensation. He did not argue theory. He did not defend the design. He said one thing: the iron will not be cold. Then he turned back and kept working. The words did not sound like a debate. They sounded like a stake driven into the ground. And from that moment on, the question was no longer whether the idea was strange. It was whether that sentence would survive the winter. Because if it failed, nothing else would matter. The first fire inside the cylinder did not prove the idea wrong, but it did not prove it right either. It proved something more useful, that a sound idea could still fail in the details. The iron shell took heat the way Quillen expected. The air inside steadied faster than any wooden cabin ever had. The cold did not rush in the same way. The space held, but not perfectly. Near the lower edge of the door where wood met iron, Mara noticed it first. A faint strip of cool air, subtle but real, and just above it, a thin line of damp along the seam, not dripping, not spreading, but present. It was enough to show that if left alone, that small flaw could grow into the very failure Harlan had warned about. Quillen did not argue with it. He did not pretend it wasn't there. He stayed awake most of the night. With a lantern hung low, he moved slowly along the interior, placing his hand against the iron, then the seams, then the floor, feeling, not guessing, watching how the warmth settled, where it moved, where it hesitated. He shifted the stove only a few inches, enough to change how heat reached the curve of the shell. He set a simple metal plate behind it to push more radiant heat outward instead of letting it pool. He tightened the door fit, added packing where wood met iron, lowered a crude barrier along the floor line to break the thin draft that crept under, and at the entrance, he hung a second layer, a rough inner curtain to catch the shock of cold air each time the door opened. None of it was dramatic. All of it mattered. The next night, the damp line was gone. The cool strip had disappeared. Mara checked the same place without a word, pressed her hand there, held it, then looked at him not with relief alone, but with a kind of quiet recognition. This was the difference. Quillen Voss had not been right because he guessed correctly. He had been right because he understood enough to correct what was wrong before it could become failure. Out there, that was the only kind of right that lasted. What Quillen Voss had built was not a trick. It was a system. And it worked for reasons that could be felt long before they were explained. The stove inside the cylinder did what any stove would do. It burned fuel and gave off heat. But in a wooden cabin, most of that heat rose, gathered near the ceiling, and slipped away through gaps before it ever settled into the space where people lived. Here, something different happened. The moment the stove warmed the air, that heat met the iron shell, and instead of resisting it, the metal accepted it, quickly, evenly. The curved walls did not stay cold. They absorbed the warmth, and then gave it back slow, steady, in all directions. The entire interior surface began to act as one broad, quiet source of heat. Not a single hot point surrounded by cold, but a space where warmth existed everywhere at once. That changed everything. The heat did not collect uselessly above a man's head. It spread. It settled. It reached the floor, the walls, the tools, the bedding. It reached the body without requiring a man to sit beside the fire to feel it. A cup of water set well away from the stove stayed liquid through the night. Cornbread left on the table did not turn hard by morning. Ruth sat near the center of the space, not pressed against the stove, and her hands stayed warm enough to play. Mara worked with a needle in a place where, the winter before, her fingers would have gone stiff within minutes. The difference was not louder. It was quieter. There was no constant rush of cold air replacing what had just been warmed. No invisible current undoing the work of the fire. The air inside remained the same air, held in place, gaining warmth instead of losing it. The shape helped. A curved shell exposed less surface to the outside than a square structure of the same size. Fewer edges, fewer weak points, less opportunity for heat to escape. But more than anything, it was the seal. Quillen was no longer trying to warm a moving stream. He was warming a contained volume and keeping it. And that answered the question Harlan Pike had raised. Condensation came from cold surfaces pulling moisture out of warm air. But inside that cylinder, the walls were no longer cold enough to do that work. They had become part of the heat itself, not a barrier, a participant. The iron did not sweat. It held. And once that could be seen, not argued, but lived inside, the outcome of the coming winter no longer depended on chance. It depended on whether that system could endure what was on its way. The first cold did not come as a storm. It came in quiet passes, thin waves of winter, testing the ground. The wind sharpened. The air dried. Night stretched longer, colder, more deliberate. These were not the blows that broke a man. They were the ones that asked questions, and the cylinder began to answer. The fire inside did not need to roar. A steady, modest burn carried through the evening, and still the warmth held, not in one place, but across the space. The air did not turn stale. It did not cling damp to the walls. There was no frost forming in hidden corners. A dipper of water left near the center of the room cooled through the night, but did not freeze. Ruth slept without curling tight against the stove. Her breathing stayed even. Mara woke in the morning and moved her hands without that first sharp ache of returning feeling. She noticed it without saying it. There was no single moment to point to. No loud proof. Just the absence of failure. That was enough. Outside, the land began to change its tone. The light flattened. The horizon lost its softness. The north wind grew straighter, harder, less forgiving with each passing day. It did not feel like weather turning worse. It felt like something that had been waiting, finally stepping forward. The early cold had asked its questions, and the real judgment began at the end of January. The wind came first, hard, straight, and without pause. It did not swirl, it drove. Snow already on the ground lifted and moved sideways in long, pale sheets, skimming the surface like something alive and searching. Then the sky closed. What followed was not the kind of storm men spoke about with any beauty. No towering drifts, no quiet snowfall. This was a dry, white-out fine, cutting, relentless. Distance collapsed. A man could lose his bearings walking between his own outbuildings. The wind pushed past 60 miles an hour at its worst. The temperature dropped past 30 below. And it stayed. For 11 days, the land ceased to exist as separate things. Fence lines disappeared, paths vanished. Doors were sealed shut by packed snow. Barns became shelters in the truest sense, places to hold on, not places to work. Every structure in that country entered the same trial. And nature did not argue. It did not raise its voice. It did not rush its work. It simply pressed. Against every board, every seam, every place where one material met another, it searched for weakness the way water finds a crack. And when it found one, it did not need to force it open. It only needed to stay. Cold moved in, heat moved out, and the balance shifted. There was only one question being asked, and it did not need words. How much could a man keep once winter began to take? Out on that ground, belief did not matter anymore. Only structure did. The storm did not choose sides. It treated every man the same. At Harlan Pike's place, the fire never went out. It could not. The stove burned hot, fed hard, and often. Wood stacked close, split faster than it could be replaced. The heat gathered where it always had tight around the source, strong enough to feel on one side of a man's body and gone on the other. Beyond that circle, the cold held its ground. Along the north wall, frost crept in thin lines around nail heads and seams. Not thick, not dramatic, just enough to show where warmth failed. A bucket set a few feet from the stove froze solid by morning, not slowly, not over days, overnight. Eben Sorrel moved through the dark in short cycles. Wake. Feed the fire. Wait. Watch. Lie down. Rise again. There was no rest in it. Only maintenance. Blankets were hung to close off part of the room. The sleeping space shrank to what could be defended. The rest of the house might as well have been outside. Men and women did not live in that space. They endured it. They held back loss one armload of wood at a time. Across the open ground, the wind struck Quillen Voss's cylinder just as hard. But the sound was different. It did not catch and tear along flat walls. It slid, skimmed, passed over the curved shell with a dull, shifting tone, as if it could not find a place to hold. Inside, the fire was smaller. It did not need to be larger. The stove burned steady, not strained. The heat moved outward, met the iron, and spread again. The walls gave it back without urgency. The air did not churn. It stayed. Mara sat near the center of the space, not pressed to the stove, working a needle through worn cloth. Her hands moved without hesitation. Ephraim sat a short distance away, mending a strap. Ruth played on the floor between them, her breath even, her shoulders loose, not drawn in against cold. There was no circle of survival. There was a room, a full one. The difference was not that one place was hot and the other cold. The difference was that in one place life had narrowed to a point around fire. In the other, it had not narrowed at all. There was no rush to feed the stove before heat collapsed. No fear of what would happen when the flames dropped. No quiet calculation of how long the warmth would last. It simply remained. On that same land, under that same storm, two kinds of houses stood. One tried to fight the cold and lost ground with every hour. The other held what it had gained and kept it. And in that difference, something larger than comfort was being decided, because the structure that preserved ordinary life was the one that was going to outlast the winter. By the seventh day, the storm had stopped being something a man endured. It had become something he measured himself against and often found himself short. Harlan Pike did not go out because he wanted to. A group of heavy cows, close to calving, had been driven into a low draw north of his place before the storm set in. If they went down there, the loss would carry through the season. That was reason enough. So he went. The wind took his breath the moment he cleared the lee of the barn. Snow drove sideways, thin and hard, stinging the eyes, flattening distance. The world shrank to a narrow band ahead of his horse. Halfway out, one of the animals he had taken along faltered. Its front leg dropped into a hidden cut under the snow crust. It came up wrong, favoring the limb, weight uneven. That changed things. There was no easy turn back, no clear line forward. Only white, wind, and a growing awareness of how close a man could come to losing himself within sight of his own land. Then he saw it. A dark curve, breaking the white, low, smooth, unmistakable. Voss's kettle. He angled toward it, leading the injured horse by hand. The wind struck harder in the open, but the shape ahead gave him something solid to reach for. Not shelter, not yet, but something to stand against. He brought the horse alongside the iron shell and leaned into it, bracing himself, and waited for the cold. It should have been there, hard, immediate. The kind that bit through glove and bone alike. It wasn't. What met him instead was something he did not understand at first. Warmth. Not the sharp heat of a stove, not a surface that burned, but a deep, steady warmth that held its place, as if it belonged there. He froze not from cold, but from the shock of it. Slowly, he pulled off one glove, placed his bare hand against the iron, held it there. The metal did not steal heat from him. It gave it back. He looked down along the base of the cylinder. Snow lay everywhere else in hard, wind-packed lines. But along the edge where iron met ground, it had pulled back, thinned, softened, unwilling to cling. Everywhere else on that land, winter took hold. Here, it did not in the way it should have. 20 years of hard-earned belief did not break in argument. It broke in silence. Harlan Pike stood there, with his hand on that wall, and in that moment, he knew. Then he knocked. The door opened, and the air that met him was not just warm. It was proof. Harlan Pike stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The storm vanished. Not in sound, it still pressed against the outer shell, but in effect, the air inside did not move the way it had outside. It held. It settled around him without force, without bite. Quillen handed him a tin cup of coffee. Harlan took it and stood for a moment before sitting, his eyes moving slowly across the interior. There was no frost on the walls, no dampness gathering in corners, no smell of wet wood or trapped breath. Mara worked as she had before. Ruth shifted in place, awake and calm. The stove burned steady, not pushed, not starved. Nothing in that space suggested a family bracing itself against the next drop in temperature. It was simply a room. That was what struck him hardest. Not the heat, the normalcy. For a long moment, Harlan said nothing. Then he spoke, not to challenge, not to test, but to mark what he had just seen. "You didn't build a shell," he said. He turned the cup in his hands once. "You closed a piece of weather in here and locked the cold out." Quillen did not answer. He did not need to. When the storm finally broke, it left its record across the land. Frozen pumps, lost stock, split beams, houses that had held but only barely, and one story that moved faster than all the rest. It began with Harlan Pike. Men who had heard him laugh now heard him explain. Not with pride, not with apology, but with the weight of someone who had seen something with his own hands and could not deny it. He described the wall, the warmth, the way the cold had failed to take hold. That was enough. By spring, the questions began. Measurements. methods, details that had been ignored before, now asked for plainly. Quillen answered them the same way he had worked. Without display, he showed where seams had to be tight, where the door could not be left loose, how the stove should be placed, not by guess, but by how heat would move. He corrected mistakes before they were made, not for praise, but because he understood where failure began. Even Harlan returned, not to argue, to build. A smaller cylinder went up on his land, meant for calves when the late cold came through again, not as an experiment, as a decision. The following winter, a different kind of witness took note. Dr. Elias Wren, a traveling physician who covered the homesteads along that stretch of Nebraska, had seen enough cold seasons to know their pattern. Every year, the same complaints: tight chests, persistent coughs, children weakened by air that shifted too fast from warm to cold. But something did not match that pattern, not at the Voss place. When he stepped inside the cylinder, he noticed the warmth, but he did not stop there. He noticed what was missing. No sharp drafts cutting across the room, no cold walls pulling moisture out of the air, no sudden drop in temperature when the fire eased. The air held steady. It did not strain the lungs. It did not turn harsh overnight. It remained fit to breathe. That was new, and it mattered. Dr. Wren began to speak of it in terms other men understood, not as novelty, not as trick construction, but as a place where the conditions of living had changed in a way that affected the body itself. The house did not just keep people warm, it kept them well. In time, the story outgrew the land it started on, but its shape remained the same. Quillen Voss had not brought a miracle to the frontier. He had carried a kind of knowledge across from another world and set it down where it had never been used before. He had spent years building vessels that held pressure tight enough to contain a force no man could see, strong enough to endure it without breaking. Out here, he used that same understanding for something quieter. He held a climate. The curved shell that once resisted stress now resisted loss. The seams that once kept steam in now kept warmth from leaving. The same principles, set in a different place, answered a different kind of need. That is why the result endured. Because it was not chance. It was not luck. It was the right idea, carried far enough to meet the right problem. And when the storm came to test it, there was nothing left to prove. Only something left standing. The shape that once held pressure now held warmth. And in that simple change, a man had done what every house on that land was meant to do. He had built something that could keep life inside, while winter passed over it. When everything froze around them, what do you think really made the difference? What the house was made of, or what it was designed to do?